We usually associate the Neolithic era with farmers and settled villages, but the timeline is actually quite different. Pottery, which we define as portable ceramic vessels, was actually a late Pleistocene development. It didn't spread widely until the Holocene, about 10,000 years ago, but the early adopters were not farmers. They were mobile hunter-gatherers who carried heavy, fragile things. To make these, they had to take clay that was fashioned into a desired shape, dried to reduce its water content, and then fired or baked to fix its form. These are ceramics, clay forms fashioned into shapes, dried, and deliberately heated at high temperatures to produce a durable product. It is a very specific and very inconvenient invention. Imagine the riverbanks of the Paleolithic. Your feet are sinking into thick, gray slime. It is cold, it is wet, and it is incredibly sticky. This is clay. Most of us think of it as a craft project, but for early humans, it was just a physical property of the landscape. They noticed it held a shape. They noticed it reacted to heat. Long before the first bowl existed, people were experimenting with the material in very practical, very flat ways. For instance, Neanderthals in Italy during the Middle Paleolithic may have used clay slabs around hearth fires as heat-storing grills for cooking meat. It was a simple solution. Then, around 35,000 years ago, people at an Aurignacian site in Greece used clay to line pits, possibly for toasting wild seeds. No pots, no wheels. Just people putting mud in a hole and hoping the fire would do something useful. About 28,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, the Pavlovian culture of Gravettian Europe began experimenting with clay. This wasn't about pots, it was about art. In Moravia, at sites like Dolny Vestanici I and II, Pavlo I and VI, and Predmosti, mammoth hunters lived in houses built from mammoth bone. But they separate the heat. In a structure called the Shaman's hut, they built specially constructed clay ovens. Here, they produced 489 ceramic artifacts, including small clay figures of animals and people. One of the most famous is the Venus of Dolny Vestanici, a ceramic figurine of a voluptuous woman. If you look closely, you can see the fingerprint of a child. Some researchers believe these weren't just for art. They suggest the shaman's hut was for theatrical shamanistic displays. The idea is that the shaman would throw damp clay balls into the fire, causing them to explode due to expanding steam. A very loud, very permanent way to get people to listen. At some point, the focus shifted from making figures of animals and women to making things that could actually hold something. In the southern Urals, at the Shylon Tash Cave, a ceramic fragment 6 centimeters in diameter was found. It was dated to around 16,000 BC, and it wasn't a lapwing or a lion. It was a pigment pot for cave artists. To turn that piece of wet clay into a stone-like material, it had to be fired at 500 to 600 degrees centigrade. Meanwhile, in China, the timeline moves even further back. The oldest radiocarbon-dated pottery in the world comes from the Xianren Dong Cave in Jiangxi, dating to approximately 18,000 BC. This is thousands of years before pottery appeared in Japan, Korea, or the Russian Far East. Other evidence appears in Hunan, at the Yusenyang Cave in Dawan County, where pottery has been dated to approximately 16,300 BC. One reconstructed vessel from that site is 29 centimeters tall, with a round rim 31 centimeters in diameter. It doesn't have a flat bottom because it was likely pushed into the soft ground or set into the fire. It has a pointed base. This is where the transition happens. The art became a tool. Let's look at the actual objects. The pottery from Yusenyang Cave was not exactly a masterpiece of fine china. It was coarsely made with walls up to 2 centimeters thick. These were chunky, primitive things. They were fired at low temperatures between 400 and 500 degrees Celsius, which is barely enough to get the clay to hold. Now, if you're wondering why they were pointed-based, it wasn't for aesthetics. Pointed-based and round, porous vessels are simply better at withstanding the stresses of thermal shock compared to flat-bottom pots. If you put a flat pot in the fire, it cracks. To stop this, the makers added something called temper. This is material added to the clay to prevent it from shrinking and cracking during drying and firing. It is a very basic but essential technical solution to a very clunky problem. There is a strange detail on the exterior of these ancient pots: cord marks. These impressions leave a trace of the weaving process. It is highly likely that early humans didn't just shape clay, but used woven basket molds. In fact, the very first pots may have evolved from the practice of lining baskets with clay to make them watertight. It wasn't just the utility. The concept was the same. The construction of early pottery via coiling long rolls of clay was conceptually similar to weaving a basket. These cord impressions, along with incisions or pits, actually served a purpose. Rougher surfaces improved heat transfer and thermal shock resistance, which kept the pots from exploding in the fire. It also made handling heavy pots with slippery hands much easier. Next, we have to ask, what exactly were they cooking in these heavy, fragile things? Remember that question. It changes everything. Chemical testing reveals a very specific, very greasy kind of utility. In early China, these pots were used to extract grease from bones, which is essentially a prehistoric way of rendering fat. Across northern China, the Russian Far East, and Japan, the diet shifted toward aquatic resources, specifically fish soup. European hunter-gatherers had a more divided menu. In the West and Northeast, they focused on ruminants: deer, elk, bison, aurochs, and reindeer. In the South and East, they pivoted to aquatic resources. Then we have the Baltic societies. They weren't just cooking, they were experimenting with fermentation. They used their pottery to prepare a fermented blood porridge or cake made from seal blood and wild grains. If that doesn't sound appetizing, they also made a mixture of seal meat and blubber with cranberries or lingonberries. They relied on the benzoic acid in the berries as a preservative, effectively turning their clay pots into a prehistoric refrigerator. It's a very practical, very red diet. It is a matter of efficiency. Before pottery, hunter-gatherers used hot stones to heat water in containers for cooking. This was a tedious process. You had to find the scones, heat them in the fire, and then drop them into a skin or bark container. It was a low-tech, Stone Age same of the same. If you wanted to stew, you basically had to gamble with the same of the same. But a clay pot is a game changer. It allows you to put the vessel itself directly into the fire. This means high-calorie grease and fats, the kind of fuel that keeps a human being alive during an ice age, could be extracted and consumed without waste. Carrying a heavy, fragile pot through the wild was a risk, but the reward was a high-calorie diet. It was a prehistoric diet plan based entirely on grease. And that is the most logical way to survive a frozen wasteland. Crushed shells were the go-to additive for early Holocene Eurasian ceramics, particularly in coastal, river, and wetland regions. It was a practical choice. In Finland, however, the strategy shifted to asbestos, which in fact served as temper to help the clay dry properly in cold and wet conditions. Now, let's consider who was actually doing this work. Ethnographic reports suggest pottery was a female-led technology, as women were more likely to tend the hearth and prepare food. It is a remarkably simple equation. Those who spend the most time by the fire, and with the material, develop the technology. The knowledge didn't stay in one place. It traveled. As women moved between groups through female exogamy, the blueprints for these heavy, fragile pots became a shared continental scale of survival. Pottery was a game changer, but some groups simply didn't want it. It took until 5900 BC to emerge north of the Caspian, and didn't reach Fennoscandia and Denmark until around 4800 BC. That is a gap of thousands of years where people chose to stick with leather skins or bark. Why the delay? Some theories suggest early pottery was not a basic necessity, but rather status symbols or for special events like occasional feasting. Carrying a heavy, breakable pot was a price some people were willing to pay for the prestige of a party, while others preferred the lightness of a skin bag. For thousands of years, humans carried around heavy, breakable chunks of fired mud, not because they loved the aesthetic, but because they were obsessed with grease. The transition from a child's fingerprint on a Venus figurine to a pointed base pot used to render bone marrow is a strange trajectory. We went from making art that could explode in a shaman's fire to making tools that could withstand the heat of a hearth. It all started with someone noticing that the riverbank slime they were standing in could become as hard as stone if they just stopped poking it and start burning it. And yet, for millennia, entire civilizations looked at this technology and decided that a leather bag was simply more convenient. It leaves one wondering why the most significant leap in food processing took so long to convince everyone to carry a heavy pot.